Hey, History of St. Louis, welcome to the Civil War in St. Louis. Today we're going to be taking a look at St. Louis and race relations. We're going to talk a little bit about the general facts of the Civil War in Missouri and then some St. Louis specific incidences that deal with race, first from the Civil War era, and then we're going to work our way to modern times in race. So here we go. There is a worksheet that you should have that you can fill out as we go through this presentation. This presentation will also act as a model for you for your Civil War project that you will be presenting over the next days here in class. So when Missouri wants to join the United States, the government at that time was trying to balance slave states and free states so that we wouldn't have an imbalance and cause more conflict than we already did. So when Missouri wanted to join as a slave state, they first had to find another state that would join as a free state, and they were able to get Maine to step in. So Maine is admitted as a free state in 1820. Missouri is admitted as a slave state in 1821. And that deal is known as the Missouri Compromise. That compromise also establishes the Missouri Compromise line, which is a geographic line, and any state that would enter after this deal above that line would automatically be a free state, and any state that wanted to join the United States that was below that line would automatically enter as a slave state. Eventually, this is going to be nullified by the Dred Scott case and another act that will be passed just before that called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So the Missouri Compromise basically draws a line using Missouri's southern border, and that would be the new line for slave versus free. Later on, it will be raised up a little bit to coincide with the Oklahoma line so that they wouldn't have to have a slither of the state be free and then a slither of the state be slave. So there are three states, and I'm going to go back here. There are going to be three states that will eventually join the Union but be a slave state, and that is Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland. Those three states will be known as border states in that they are slave states but fight for the Union. And one of your presentations is going to talk about the debate that Missouri goes through on whether it should join the Union or join the Confederacy. Missouri will vote for the Democrat in the 1860 election, the more slave allowing party, Stephen Douglas, but St. Louis, being a little bit more liberal, votes heavily for Lincoln, the Republican, and the more liberal person who was willing to give up on some slavery issues. Missouri obviously is going to be torn between the Union sympathizers and Confederate sympathizers. Pro-slavery Missouri politicians wanted the state to join the Confederacy. Obviously, the Union supporters want us to stay in the Union, and so this is going to be a fight early on in Missouri history until things get played out and the Union sympathizers win. Before this, though, I want to tell you the story of a gentleman named Francis McIntosh that sort of highlights St. Louis's troubled past when it comes to relations or racial relations. This story will take place in 1836 and involves a gentleman by the name of Francis McIntosh, who was a worker on a steamboat that was coming into St. Louis from Ohio. And was dropping off its goods. He got paid for doing his work that day and decided to go into town to spend his money. Francis McIntosh, is a mulatto, which means that he is half white, half black. So basically, we would call him a light-skinned African American today. On his way back home from eating and drinking, he's going to notice some African Americans running from the police, and he allows them to hide on the boat to try to get away from the police. The police eventually catch the gentlemen who were hiding from them, and also then arrest Francis McIntosh for aiding and abetting those individuals. So now he is placed under arrest, and is being walked to jail. So his initial crime is interfering with the police or aiding and abetting uh, some criminals. And so that's what he initially gets arrested for. As he's walking to jail, he asks the police officers, "What's going to happen to me?" Now remember, he's from Ohio, which is a free state. He is a visitor. He's a little bit drunk, and the police officers, two white police officers, by the way, one of them says, "Oh, we'll probably kill you," in jest, but he didn't take it as jest. So he thinks, "Oh my gosh, I'm about to die." So he attempts to and does break away from the police officers. And in the process, he is able to grab one of the police officers' knife and stab him, and that wound will end up killing the police officer. He then also stabs the second police officer, who survives that day, but I think 3 or 4 days later ends up dying from his wounds. And so he starts running away and ends up running into a dead end, where then some citizens who witnessed it and chased him down will capture him and then take him to the police jail. And then those citizens afterwards start rallying and talking about what had happened, and were getting emotionally fired up from this. Most of them were white. And so what we know next happens is that that mob goes into the St. Louis jail. Now, we don't know what happens inside the jail. We're not sure whether the police put up a fight or not. But we do know is that that mob ends up coming out of the police station with Francis McIntosh. And they are going to march him to a tree that is located right next to the old courthouse, and they are going to lynch him for the murder of two police officers. Now, one of them ends up surviving for a little bit longer, but they thought at the time that both of them were killed. So what we don't know, again, is that whether the police let him out of the jail or tried to stop the mob and just were overpowered, but we do know that a mob forms. At that tree scene, somebody shouts out that lynching isn't bad enough. And so the crowd decides instead to chain him to the tree, bring a whole bunch of brushwood, and light the brushwood on fire, and thus lighting Francis McIntosh on fire. In this scene, you see the mob, looking on. Somebody asks, usually, why didn't somebody try to save him? And that is because of this politician right here. This politician you can't really see, but he is holding a gun, and he actually was pointing it at the crowd, basically saying if anybody tried to free Francis McIntosh from this incident, they would be shot by him. We also have other St. Louis citizens adding to the fire. Reports suggest that Francis McIntosh will be alive for 18 minutes while burning alive. Witnesses also claim that at one point in time his abdominal area had burned, and that his intestines and stomach actually spilled out of his body while he was conscious and alive. They asked him if he was in pain, and he was screaming yes, in a great deal of pain. And after 18 minutes, he finally was either made unconscious or just died from the wounds. But this is the burning of Francis McIntosh. The next day, newspapers reported what had happened. Some of the newspapers took the side of the police and basically said that this gentleman got what he deserved, that he had stabbed 2 officers, killing one and majorly injuring another, while other newspapers like the Observer basically said that this is a stain on the city and that we would develop a very bad reputation because of our savagery, and that this is something that we should not have allowed to have happened. One group in particular that will really call negative attention to this is going to be the German Americans in St. Louis. And the German Americans are upset because they feel that if this could happen to an African American, then it could happen to them as immigrants. And so they were afraid that this might be a new type of activity that could be used against them. So the German Americans in St. Louis are very fearful of this event and what it could mean to them. In the days after, because of all the press attention, the St. Louis government decides to set up an investigation as to what had happened, and that investigation is going to be led by a gentleman named Luke Lawless, Judge Luke Lawless, and I am not making up his name, that is his real name. And Judge Luke Lawless is going to lead an investigation to see what happened and what should have happened and how this was allowed to happen. The problem with him and his investigation is he is a known racist. And so what ends up happening is he investigates and then he comes out with a report that basically stipulates 3 major findings. Number one finding was that Francis McIntosh's rights were definitely violated, that this was an act of vigilante justice and it should have been dealt with by the court system. Number 2, that the actions taken by or taken on Francis McIntosh were done by a mob. And because this was a mob action, number 3, you cannot hold anybody in individual contempt for the murder of Francis McIntosh because this was a mob event. Even though they know the people who walked him out of the jail, who tied him up, who lit the fire, who pulled a gun on the crowd, even though they knew who those individuals were, Judge Lawless's findings was that because it's a mob event, nobody can be held personally responsible. And so nobody ends up going to jail for the murder of Francis McIntosh. One gentleman who reports about this and takes a very negative view of the city of St. Louis about this is a gentleman named Elijah Lovejoy, and that will be our next presentation done by students, or that'll be our first student presentation either later today or tomorrow. So here are our answers for the worksheet that you're looking at. And then don't worry about this last one. We're going to go ahead and do this one together in just a little bit, but this is what you should have for your worksheet as far as the Francis McIntosh incident. So if the teacher needs to, they can press pause and let students check their notes to make sure that they have everything correct. Okay, so let's get into some more modern issues with race relations in St. Louis. St. Louis, unfortunately, has a very checkered past when it comes to race relations. This also then later on in 1917, we see some major race riots in the East St. Louis area, but it does involve St. Louis. This goes on in the last days of May and the early days of June in 1917. Basically, black workers from East St. Louis go on strike against the businesses in St. Louis who they work for. And in that day and age, when business owners were dealing with strikes. Sometimes they would call in mobs to sort of force the workers back to work. And this will lead to the worst and most deadly labor riot in the 20th century. Eventually, 150 blacks are going to be killed when white rioters cross over into East St. Louis and basically start bashing the black community, trying to get them to go back to work. The well-known black activist Marcus Garvey stated that this is a massacre that will go down in history as one of the bloodiest outrages against mankind for which any class of people could be held guilty. The National Guard will have to be called in. It actually draws the attention of President Woodrow Wilson at the time, and it's just an ugly scene here in St. Louis. Later on, during the just before the civil rights era, St. Louis city pools are segregated into white and black pools, but in the summer of 1949, the city decides to desegregate the swimming pools and allow blacks and whites to swim together. And so this is going to cause a problem at Fairgrounds Pool in Fairgrounds Park. On this day where the swimming pools were supposed to be desegregated, we have a number of black swimmers who are coming to what was previously a white pool, and basically they were ready to swim. There were some white protesters who wanted to keep them out of the pool, and all of a sudden a race riot develops. This takes 3 or 4 days. There's a curfew placed in the area. You can see here that the police are actually arresting, for some reason, a black person who was actually beaten at the scene. Eventually, the city government will say to the white protesters, these pools are going to be desegregated. And so the whites eventually start opening up private pools where they are allowed to continue to segregate. But this caused a pretty 2 or 3 day riot in St. Louis over the public pool system. Some other key events in 1983, St. Louis City and County are ordered to desegregate their education program. This is where we start busing out city students to the counties. Parkway is still continuing to do this today in 2020. Although they are just basically allowing the families that are in the system to continue. They are not taking any more. And this desegregation program was ordered by a judge named William Hungate, and that is his picture. About 10 years later, St. Louis City elects its first black mayor, Freeman Bosley Jr., and then he is replaced by another black mayor, the second black mayor. Then in the summer of 2008, we have Cookie Johnson, who wins a contract from the city of Kirkwood to, I believe, pave some of the streets and parking lots. But because he was a one-man team, he was taking longer than the city was wanting, and so they were threatening to take his contract away, and I think eventually did. And that upset Mr. Johnson and eventually led to him storming into a Kirkwood City Hall meeting and shooting people. He was eventually shot himself, but this is one of those public shootings that made national attention in the United States and drew an unfortunate attention to Kirkwood. But probably the incident that brings the most attention to St. Louis in the recent past is the shooting of Michael Brown in the summer of 2014, which touches off the Ferguson riots as we know it and as the nation knows it. Ferguson is a county area. This is the airport right here. So Ferguson is literally just to the east. This is Highway 170. So Ferguson is just below 270 and tucked in east of Highway 170. This is the area where the McClure School District would be. Ferguson schools are actually known as the McClures. So if you know of McClure or McClure North or McClure South Berkeley, that's the area that we're talking about. And so basically, this whole story revolves around this gentleman right here, Michael Brown, an 18-year-old, and Officer Darren Wilson of the Ferguson Police Department. What will result are days of protests, followed by a couple months of calm, and then right near Thanksgiving, riots kick back up again, and we'll explain why. So what I'm going to attempt to do is just sort of iron out the general facts of this. I know that there's a lot of fact and fiction as to what happened and why it happened. We're going to try to sift through what's real and what's reality and what is rhetoric. I'm going to try to give you sort of the neutral position of what happened that day, and then we all can discuss sort of the rhetoric things that have said. So we know that Ferguson is primarily a black city with a predominantly white police force and white government officials. And we know that, for instance, that the police department was heavily ticketing the black community for things like speeding and trespassing and stuff in order to help pay for city functions, which is common in a lot of small cities and municipalities like this. And it started to develop some ill will between the community and the police force. Michael Brown, who was 18, had just graduated from Normandy High School and was set to begin his freshman year at Vatterott College, a local college here in St. Louis. Officer Darren Wilson was a 28-year-old white police officer who had been with the Ferguson Police Department for 6 years. While on the police force, he had no prior disciplinary record issues whatsoever. What basically happens is there is a shooting of Michael Brown by Darren Wilson on August 9th of 2014. Michael Brown and a friend of his, Dorian Johnson, were walking in the middle of a road when Officer Wilson had pulled up and asked them to move to a sidewalk, and basically he had initially approached them for jaywalking, for walking in the middle of a street. And then this is where then things start to get a little bit murky as far as what the police say versus what the family of Michael Brown and whatnot say. Officer Wilson will get out of the car and approach Michael Brown. We know that there is a physical altercation between them. And then here is where then the stories start to diverge and split. And I'm going to give you both sides. Police say that when Wilson got out of his SUV, Michael Brown tried to shove him back into the vehicle and reached for the officer's gun, prompting the first shots to take place. Police say that Michael Brown turned back toward the car and charged the officer after being shot once, and the officer then fired to protect himself. St. Louis County Police Chief John Belmer said that the shooting occurred after Brown pushed Wilson back into the squad car, where he physically assaulted the officer and then struggled over Wilson's weapon. According to Officer Belmer, Wilson then fired once from the car and then several more times as Brown attempted to flee and run away. Dorian Johnson, Michael Brown's friend, stated that after telling the teens to get on the sidewalk, Wilson started to drive away, but then reversed his vehicle and backed it up and struck Brown with the SUV door as he was getting out. He said Officer Brown then got out of the car, struggled with Brown, and began to shoot Brown. Wilson does fire multiple shots at Brown. At least one of them was fired from the squad car. They find that shell casing inside of the car. We know that Michael Brown was unarmed, and all of the shell casings that were fired from the police officer's gun were found at the scene. An ambulance does arrive quickly on the scene after the shooting, but Brown's body cannot be moved and has to lay there for 4 hours due to a shortage of the forensic team, which has to take all the photographs and document where everything is. And so that 4 hours is dramatically longer than what normally happens. And that starts to draw the attention of the community around where the shooting took place. And local residents began taking pictures and taking videos and posting on social media. And this is when then the community starts to get more focused on what happened. And this is when then ill temper starts to raise. Michael Baden, who was hired by the Brown family to conduct an autopsy, found that Brown was shot at least 6 times and that all of the bullets were fired into his front. Baden also determined that Brown had been shot twice in the head and that a bullet that hit the top of his head was most likely the shot that killed him. Baden said that he did not find evidence of gunshot residue on Brown's body, which would suggest that he was not shot at close range, but Baden did have to note that he was not able to test Brown's clothing, so that he could not say whether or not it had residue on it, and that could prove that he was shot at close distance, but that the residue would be found on the clothing. The next day, after a candlelight vigil, people protesting Brown's death smash car windows and carry away arms load of food, alcohol, and other looted items from stores. Some protesters stand on police cars, taunting officers. A Quick Trip convenience store on West Florissant, blocks away from where Brown was shot, is looted and burned. Other businesses are damaged or destroyed. It is the first of several nights of unrest, and so this begins sort of the rioting portion of the history. The next day, the FBI opens up an investigation into Brown's death, and 2 men who said that they saw the shooting tell reporters that Brown had his hands raised when the officers fired repeatedly. That night, police in riot gear fired tear gas at the rubber bullets and tried to disperse the crowd. By the way, those 2 reports is where the phrase "hands up, don't shoot" comes from. And so one of the questions is, was he shot while trying to give up or not? This is where the 2 sides differ from the police and the family. August 14th, the Missouri State Highway Patrol takes over of the security, relieving the Ferguson and St. Louis County officers of their law enforcement. The shift in command comes after images of protests show many officers equipped with military-style gear, including armored vehicles, body armor, and assault rifles. Most of those are from the St. Louis County. And so to try to de-escalate, the Missouri State Highway Patrol takes over. August 15th, police identified the shooter as officially Darren Wilson, who had been with the department since 2011. They also released surveillance that shows Brown grabbing a large amount of cigarillos from behind a counter of a Ferguson market and pushing a worker who confronts him as he leaves. Police say Brown took almost $50 worth of cigars or cigarillos. The release of the video upsets protesters because they basically say, what does this have to do with the shooting? That even if he did do that, that's not worth being shot over. August 16th, Missouri Governor Jay Nixon declares a state of emergency and imposes curfew. That is because they had, as you could tell from the timeline, about 6 days of continuous rioting. August 18th, Nixon calls out the National Guard to help restore order, and he lifts the curfew. August 21st, he orders the National Guard to withdraw. And then about a month later, Ferguson Police Chief Jackson releases a videotaped apology to the Brown family and attempts to march in solidarity with the protesters. However, this move backfires when officers from Ferguson scuffle with demonstrators and arrest one person moments after Jackson, who is white, joins the group. Then it's up to, well, let me go on. Nixon then declares a state of emergency and activates the National Guard ahead of the decision from the grand jury. He places Ferguson police in charge of the security with orders for them to work as a unified command. Basically, what's happening around November 17th is St. Louis County prosecutors go to a grand jury and try to determine whether or not to press charges on the police officer. And they were given a heads up that the decision was going to be announced relatively soon. And so Nixon starts to gear up for that decision. And then on November 24th, just before Thanksgiving, St. Louis County Prosecutor Bob McCullough announces that the grand jury has decided not to indict Wilson, that there was not enough evidence to merit a criminal trial. Protests that were passionate but peaceful early in the day turned violent. At least a dozen buildings and multiple police cars are burned. Officers are hit by rocks and batteries, and reports of gunfire forced some St. Louis flights to be diverted. And basically, we have another 3 days or so of rioting once again. So that's just sort of a general look at what had happened and some of the major players in this whole situation. If the teacher would like to, you guys can discuss this a little bit more, discuss what you heard about this, what were some of the reports that you had heard about this, whether they are fact or fiction, and just to get a better understanding of one of the most important racial incidences in the history of St. Louis. So that's our look. After you discuss this, you're going to go back to the Civil War and take a look at Civil War issues in St. Louis. Thanks for paying attention.